Hello and welcome to BBC News. I'm Ashton Wemborn and today I'm bringing you a special bulletin on the sonnet. In the newest development on this story, Wordsworth urges us to scorn not the sonnet. In his poem of the same name, he defends the value of the sonnet form, drawing attention to its virtues with allusions to other poets. This means that the poem must be read with contextual knowledge in order for readers to understand Wordsworth's tribute. By referring to highly regarded historical poets, the speaker demonstrates that the sonnet is an important part of poetic tradition and so should be preserved. The sonnet is frequently criticised for its strict structure, which some argue hinders the poet's ability to express their talent. However, the speaker suggests that the sonnet is a form which allows poetic talent to surface. Our imagery correspondent Annabelle will analyse the images of the key and trumpet later in light of these contextual factors in today's bulletin. The sonnet is presented as a source of light in darkness, which effectively stands alone as a symbol for hope. Yet, with contextual knowledge, the meaning of this symbol is expanded. The speaker introduces Milton to the poem, stating that a damp fell around him. Milton went blind towards the end of his life, and so the establishment of the sonnet as a source of inspiration for Milton in a difficult time shows that it is a highly valuable poetic technique. All of the poets named approached the sonnet in an unconventional way. They adapted the structure of the sonnet, creating Petrarchan, Shakespearean and Spenserian sonnets. By addressing the creators of these different sonnet forms, while using all three of them in the poem, Wordsworth shows an appreciation of the ability to adapt classical forms. Our poetic convention correspondent, Ben, will explain forms which appear in the poem later in the bulletin. By highlighting successful poets who have strayed from convention, Wordsworth praises their originality. With these contextual factors in mind, we now move to Annabelle, who will explain Wordsworth's use of symbols in the poem.
Thank you, Ashton. Wordsworth begins his poem using the image of the key as a symbol for the sonnet form, which he suggests unlocked Shakespeare's heart. Through this, the key provides a symbol for freedom, in the way that the sonnet allows Shakespeare to express his feelings. In particular, this refers to Shakespeare's feelings about love, as the symbol of this heart is also used, relating to the Shakespearean sonnets. Wordsworth continues to reinforce the different effects that this sonnet form can have on a poet through the metaphor of the sonnet being a glowworm lamp, which cheers Spenser. This symbolises the sonnet as an illuminating source of hope, as shown by the natural light imagery, and is also similar to the idea that Ashton expressed, in the way that the sonnet form provided hope for Milton. Wordsworth's use of natural imagery also alludes to the way the sonnet form has grown through different poets adapting the form, and the way the sonnet glitters a gay myrtle leaf testifies this. This is because the noun myrtle can denote to the leaf being evergreen, and therefore suggests the sonnet form will continue to flourish despite being developed. Through this, Wordsworth proposes that the sonnet form should remain to be a part of the traditions of poetry. The traditional value of the sonnet form is further explored through Wordsworth's use of musical imagery, which lies throughout the poem. Wordsworth chooses the metaphor of the small lute for the sonnet to highlight the way in which the form can be orally soothing, similar to the music of a lute. Interestingly, the symbolism of a small lute highlights that despite the sonnet being short, the effect on the reader is much larger. This is explained in the way the song of the sonnet provides the remedy for Petrarch's wound. The symbol of the lute also appears in Homer's classical text, the Odyssey. Therefore, the inclusion of this image thrusts the sonnet form into the classical tradition of literature. The continuation of the different musical instruments being used as symbols throughout the poem displays the versatility of the sonnet. An example of this is the way Tasso sounded 1,000 times this pipe, contradicting the idea that the form restricts the poet's freedom through the many times Tasso writes using the sonnet, much like the many different sounds a pipe could make. To conclude the poem, Wordsworth transforms the sonnet into a trumpet, which once blown produces soul-animating strains. Here, the trumpet symbolises a much different type of sonnet through the way the strains of the trumpet contrast the soft sound of the lute. Therefore, Wordsworth proposes that the sonnet can take on many different tones, which also relates to the symbol of the key from the beginning. This is because through the frequent musical symbols that are used throughout the poem, the key can then also refer to the key in a piece of music. Through this, although the sonnet as a form can appear rigid, Wordsworth displays the way the sonnet can be adapted through structure, content, and tone without disrupting the traditional form. This resembles the way different musical instruments intersect in an orchestral piece whilst changing key but remain harmonious. We'll now head back to Ashton.
Thanks, Annabelle. We will now look to Danielle, who will address voice, diction and tone in the poem.
Thank you, Ashton. Now let's turn to the voice, tone and diction of the poem. It is highly likely that the speaker of the poem acts as a mouthpiece for Wordsworth's own opinions about the sonnet form and its practitioners. The fact that the poem omits great French sonnet writers, such as de Bellay, Marot and Ronsard, yet includes others from continental Europe, supports this reading of the poem's speaker as being synonymous with its author, since Wordsworth was known amongst his contemporaries for his condemnation of French writers. In the poem, Wordsworth directly reprimands the sonnet's critics and commands them to scorn not the sonnet, in a voice distinctive in its authority and knowledge. This knowledge is expressed through Wordsworth's allusions to famous historical poets, such as Dante, Shakespeare and Petrarch. Wordsworth praises the sonnet form for allowing such poets to express themselves and their poetic talents. However, the tone of praise in the poem is not restricted solely to the sonnet as a poetic form. Wordsworth also praises the poets themselves for breaking out of previous structures and conventions, and for adapting and changing the sonnet form over time. The traditional volta of a sonnet that can be found after its 12th line sees Wordsworth's poem shift from its prior notion of the poet as indebted to the sonnet to the opposite suggestion that the sonnet is in fact indebted to the poet. Wordsworth uses the example of Milton, who, he says, broke away from the sonnet's prior rigidity by turning the sonnet form into a poetic trumpet that does not just speak but demands to be heard. Therefore, whilst Wordsworth's poetic voice does praise the sonnet form in many ways, it also hypocritically critiques it. With regards to the diction used within the poem, Wordsworth's 1800 edition of the Lyrical Ballads expresses his wish to use direct, natural diction close to that of ordinary speech in all of his poetry. Whilst Milton's sonnets were a major influence over his writing, Wordsworth neither writes in the dramatic Miltonic style of soul-animating strains, nor in the intimate style of the glowworm lamp that cheered Mild Spencer. But instead he writes to achieve a combination of the two. Whilst the intellectual references to classical poets and the inclusion of corresponding imagery may appear to exclude a reader uneducated in these areas, Wordsworth maintains simple language throughout that at least enables his poems to be intelligible, if not fully understood, by all. Now let's head back to Ashton in the studio.
Thanks, Danielle. We now turn to Gabrielle, who will look at rhythm, metre and rhyme.
Thank you. We now turn to the rhyme, rhythm and metre of Scorn Not the Sonnet. Wordsworth uses these extremely carefully throughout his poem in order to convey his feelings on the sonnet type. The poem is instantly recognisable as a sonnet but it is difficult to fit it into a specific category within the sonnet division. On first glance, the rhyme scheme fits the conventions of all three major sonnet types, Shakespearean, Petrarchan and Spenserian. However, on closer inspection, we see that the ABBA, ACCA, DEDEFF structure is actually a mix of all three tropes. This is interesting as it gives the piece an eclectic air. Wordsworth cannot base his ode in one fixed style, as the sonnet form is so wide-ranging and varied. In describing the sonnets throughout the years and mentioning Shakespeare, Petrarch and Spenser, it seems only right that Wordsworth uses parts of their form type in his poem, as we will see later in Ben's commentary on form and structure. The octave and the sestet remain the same, sticking to the conventional form, but Wordsworth changes the rigid structure of the sonnet not once but twice in the second and third quatrains. This subliminally makes the point that the sonnet as a rigid form is often difficult to work with. This is also echoed in the half-rhyme of frowned wound in the first quatrain, and here Wordsworth makes the point that one must sometimes abandon rhyme to a degree in order to retain a poem's feeling. The poem has a generally steady rhythm and is written in iambic pentameter, giving a smooth flow throughout. The fact that the poem sticks to this also underscores that the rhythm of a sonnet cannot be successfully altered without losing a poem's essence, and also that the sonnet as a whole has a pleasing natural rhythm which should not be mocked. It also reflects the weight of the sonnet's history. The metre and rhythm had been largely untouched long before Wordsworth, and for him to alter this drastically while simultaneously defending the sonnet would be inappropriate. However, that is not to say that Wordsworth does not leave his own touch upon the poem's rhythm. Several lines are separated with colons and semicolons, causing a break to the traditional metre. This noticeable change highlights the fact that when deviating from a standard form, uneasiness and disruption can sometimes be caused when listening. This reflects Wordsworth's mixed praise of the sonnet and critique of its rigidity. The break in the last line when describing Milton's soul-animating strains in his own exploration indicate Milton's successful break from tradition, and open perhaps the possibility for further, freer exploration of the sonnet. Wordsworth reveres Milton for his ingenuity, but does not quite dare to explore the sonnet to the same extent. With this in mind, let's hand over to Ben for analysis of form and structure.
Well, I'm here to talk about Wordsworth's use of structure, form and poetic convention. You see, in his poem Scorn Not the Sonnet, he uses a variety of structural techniques to reflect the message of a poem, the most obvious of these being his use of the very sonnet form he describes. A 14-line poem in iambic pentameter, originally consisting of an octave followed by a sestet, the sonnet is one of the oldest and most recognised styles in poetry, adopted from the Italians during the Renaissance. However, the sonnet form we are more familiar with today consists of 3 quatrains followed by a rhyming couplet, which was developed in Renaissance Britain. In Scorn Not the Sonnet, Wordsworth explicitly mentions some of the main pioneers in sonnet writing, including Petrarch, Shakespeare and Spenser, whose styles he blends together in his own poem, seen through the changing rhyme scheme in the quatrains, which fluctuates between a Shakespearean ABAB and a Petrarchan ABBA rhyme scheme. Traditionally, the sonnet would be used by lyric poets as a form of love poem, addressing an individual and praising them in some way, usually highlighting their beauty through unique and often nature-themed imagery. Wordsworth subverts this by choosing to address his sonnet towards critics of the limitations of the poetic form, and instead praises the sonnet itself, as well as preceding poets who have used the poetic form to great success. Wordsworth's language is, as poetic convention dictates, full of the metaphors and similes that so often permeate sonnet poetry. This speaker likens the sonnet to a key, a small lute, a pipe, a gay myrtle leaf, a glowworm lamp, and a trumpet, and praises the way it has led poets to unlock their hearts through producing soul-animating strains. This emphatic praise of the sonnet also plays to the convention that sonnet should be filled with the speaker's strong emotions and a celebratory attempt to vocalise his seemingly ineffable love for an object of desire. This poem can be seen as an attempt to revive the sonnet, which had started to fall out of fashion at the time of Wordsworth's writing, due to its complex structural requirements. Wordsworth promotes the potential significance and value of the sonnet, but is it possible his own message is itself limited by these very parameters? Mr. Wordsworth has declined to comment, because he's dead.
Thanks, Ben. That's all we have for you today. We hope you've enjoyed this special BBC Bulletin on the sonnet. Tune in tomorrow for an exclusive investigation into the works of Shakespeare. brainy bard or copycat conman.